Okay, this video is going to look at the rise of Andrew Jackson and what becomes known as the Age of Jackson, and some of the ways in which democracy itself transformed during the 1820s and 1830s. And Jackson had a large role in this. It's not all because of him, but he symbolizes these democratic transformations of the time. Now, before the 1820s, in general, this was a state matter, but in order to vote, you had to own property and generally be a white man. There was some variations in that. New Jersey, for instance, allowed white women to vote if they owned property all the way until 1807, then that right was taken away. Other states in the North allowed free black men who owned property to vote as well. But by the 1820s, you have a movement for what's known as Universal Manhood Suffrage. And this is misleading because universal manhood suffrage only applied to white men. The idea that you did not need to own land in order to vote. And so by the 1820s, most states have done away with those property requirements to vote. And so you have an expanding a number of voters, an expanding electorate. And so that is one significant way in which democracy changed during the early 19th century. You're going to see as well a rise in the number of elected rather than appointed officials, again, giving the voters more say over officials. There's a new style of what's politicking, of campaigning. Prior to this, Thomas Jefferson didn't run for president. It was seen as uncouth to be ambitious for such things. So friends and supporters would put his name forth and argue his case while he sat back. That was sort of the way things were up until the 20s and 30s. But then you had people like Martin Van Buren or Andrew Jackson that would step out and actually campaign themselves, which is really going to come to fruition in the 1840s. Statewide political organizations are becoming more organized and embraced, and coordinated efforts to get different candidates into office are taking place. Political parties, which at the time of the founding in the 1780s and 1790s were seen as divisive, as a threat to the republic, are now being embraced as, well, maybe this is a good way, an effective way of organizing a democratic republic. Now, Martin Van Buren is going to sort of be seen as a symbol for this new style of politicking. He will be the eighth president following Jackson. Now, Andrew Jackson is a sort of mythic figure. He's a controversial figure, rightly so. But again, he wielded so much power and influence and symbolized the upward mobility of the time that this period of the 1820s and 30s assumes his name, known as the Age of Jackson. He is a national hero by 1815 when he defeats the British at the Battle of New Orleans. But he's seen as a common man, and this largely had to do with his upbringing. He was orphaned by the age of 14. He was out on his own. He moved into the frontier area of pre-statehood Tennessee. He's going to learn the law and eventually become a lawyer and judge and well-known Indian fighter. He has a violent temper. He's quick to the trigger, and he took part in a number of well-known duels or gunfights, including a gunfight with the prominent Benton family in downtown Nashville in 1813. He will serve as 2 terms as president and again come to symbolize the sort of democratic atmosphere of the common people of the 1830s and 1840s. Now, the election of 1824, you have only one major political party at the federal level, and this is where Jackson's going to step in and run for office. You have 4 candidates: John Quincy Adams, the son of the Federalist second president John Adams. William H. Crawford is a Democratic Republican from Georgia, and he'll be largely a non-player here. He was a pretty bad alcoholic, and he has a stroke before the election and does not really play a major part. And then Henry Clay, who is a young congressman from Kentucky, known as a war hawk, who entered the House of Representatives in 1810, and almost immediately on his first day, right, he's nominated as the Speaker of the House, which had never been done before or since, and he wields a lot of power in Washington, D.C., and he's very popular among Westerners, and at this time, the West is Kentucky and Indiana and Ohio. Now, no one receives a clear majority in this four-way election. So the decision goes to the House of Representatives. And remember, Henry Clay is the Speaker of the House here. Adams is eventually going to be declared the winner by the House. And as soon as he does, he appoints Henry Clay as the Secretary of State. And all of Clay's electors are pushed over to Adams, which gives him enough to win. And so supporters of Jackson say that this is a corrupt bargain because all of Clay's supporters threw their votes to Adams. Adams now has enough to win, and Clay's the Secretary of State. Now, Secretary of State was seen as important because so many previous secretaries of state had become presidents of the United States. Thomas Jefferson had been a Secretary of State, James Madison had been, James Monroe also had, and John Quincy Adams had been a Secretary of State. So it was seen like, okay, if you give me my vote, I'll put you in this position, which will set you up for the presidency after me. So Jackson takes office, or excuse me, Adams takes office under suspicion in March of 1825, and immediately Jackson and his supporters are on the attack and campaigning for that next presidential election of 1828. You start to see the emergence of two different parties. They're not fully formed yet, but you have the followers of Jackson, known as Jacksonian Democrats, and then those that coalesce behind Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams are known as the National Republicans. And again, this is not quite the second party system, but it's sort of emerging here. That first party system of Democratic Republicans and Federalists had broken apart in 1816. This is a dirty campaign between Jackson and John Quincy Adams. It's portrayed as the backwoodsman versus the New England intellectual. And just like today, an intellectual like John Quincy Adams was looked at with suspicion, whereas Jackson supporters lauded the fact and were proud of the fact that he was not extremely literate, for instance. They saw that as a positive thing, and they promoted it. Now, Jackson is going to win this election pretty handedly. He's going to name the one-time nationalist John Calhoun as his vice president from South Carolina. Martin Van Buren will be his Secretary of State. Jackson is often given credit for what's known as the spoils system. That is, to the victor goes the spoils, and pushing out people from your predecessor in federal offices and giving your supporters those positions. Perhaps he did it more than others before him, but he was not the first, and he certainly wasn't the last. Now, his presidency, again, he's going to serve 2 terms, is going to be dominated by a few different events, and we're going to talk specifically about the bank war and nullification in this video. Now, nullification comes about. There is growing suspicion really since the founding of the Constitution in 1787 between the South and the North. And the South, as they further expand their reliance upon slavery, are fearful of a growing federal government, because they know that if the federal government gets too large, too powerful, that it can then take away their slaves. And there is also a growing abolitionist movement, a movement to end slavery in the North. So there's a lot of anxiety by the 1830s. Now, in 1828, there was a tariff passed by Congress, and a tariff is a tax on imported goods. The South, as a rule, didn't like tariffs because they made all their money by shipping their commodities, whether that was tobacco or cotton or rice, out of the country. And so they didn't want retaliatory tariffs because that would hurt their exported goods. And so they saw the tariff as the North waging a sort of economic warfare upon them. And the 1828 tariff was particularly abysmal in the eyes of many Southerners. And so Vice President John Calhoun anonymously writes what becomes known as the South Carolina Exposition and Protest. Now, again, he is the sitting vice president. He's not fooling anybody. Everybody knew who wrote this. But what he says is that the states have a constitutional right to nullify federal law. So a law passed by Congress in Washington, D.C. can be declared nullify or moot within state borders. That's what Calhoun is arguing here. And this goes back to 1798 and the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, this idea that the states have more power than the federal government. Now, Jackson believed in states' rights, but he believed in the supremacy of the Union over states, and he did not believe that a state had the right to nullify a law. So as South Carolina votes to nullify the 1828 tariff, basically says it's not in effect in this state, Congress tries to work towards a compromise. And in 1832, they're going to lower the tariff, but it is still not enough. And South Carolina continues to push this idea that they have the right to nullify these laws. Congress, with the urging of President Jackson, are going to pass what's known as the Force Bill and another compromise tariff. And the Force Bill said that the federal government had the right to use force if necessary against South Carolina to enforce federal law. Again, Jackson is setting a precedent here that Lincoln will use 30 years later, that the federal government is indivisible, that states cannot nullify or cannot leave the Union, which South Carolina had flirted with during this nullification crisis. And he also justifies the use of force to keep that Union together. And again, in 1861, as South Carolina does claim to leave the Union and secede, and then followed by several other Southern states, Lincoln says, well, we have the right to use force if necessary to keep this Union together. So this is an expansion of federal power, whether South Carolina and other Southern states liked it or not. Now, Jackson did not like banks, and the idea of a national bank partially funded and established by the United States government had been a point of contention going back to the 1790s when the first bank was put into place in 1792. Now, the Constitution does not specifically say whether or not the federal government can establish banks, but for Jackson, it's less a constitutional issue and more an issue of he didn't like banks. He thought that banks hurt common people, that it put people into states of dependence because they become indebted to the bank. And he himself had been indebted to banks and, had some hard luck financially in parts of his life. But by this point, he's a fairly wealthy slave owner, a plantation runner in Tennessee. Now, in 1819, the Supreme Court had actually, allowed or gave constitutional sanction to the bank in a famous court case known as McCulloch versus Maryland. And again, Jackson sees the expanding power of the national bank as a conspiracy against the common folk by New Englanders, by the moneyed classes. So he's going to try to run on this, be reelected. He's going to make the bank an issue because the second bank was established in 1816. It had a 20-year charter. So it was due up for rechartering not until 1836. But in 1832, the head of the bank, Nicholas Biddle, with the urging of Henry Clay, goes to Congress and asks for an early recharter. So Jackson says, we're going to make this our campaign issue. Congress gives this bank an early recharter and Jackson vetoes it. He uses his executive power, which he, during his term, had done more times than all the presidents before him put together. And in his veto message, you can read it here, he explicitly reaches out to the common folks. He says, but when the laws undertake to grant exclusive privileges, the humble members of society, the farmers, mechanics, and the laborers who have neither the time nor the means of securing like favors from the government to themselves have a right to complain of the injustice to their government. So he is invoking this sort of populist message of the common people and workers and farmers against the moneyed classes of New England. And it's immensely popular. It's going to do some pretty severe economic damage over the next decade or so. But at the time, it is seen by his supporters as him standing up for their rights that have been trampled upon by the wealthy elites. Does that sound familiar? Now, in 1832, he's going to run and win against his old foe, Henry Clay. And in the aftermath of that election is when you're going to see the growth of the Whig Party, or the establishment of the Whig Party, really. But look at this we talked about that expanding democracy of this time period, and the numbers from the 1824 election, the numbers of voters compared to the numbers of voters just 8 years later. You can see how that expansion of suffrage for white men, especially, how that drastically transformed the number of people, or enlarged the number of people that are taking part in this process. Now, Jackson is going to eventually set about killing the bank, and partially he does that by establishing, removing federal money and placing them in pet banks in the states themselves that were completely unregulated, and again would cause a lot of economic harm, and be a major factor in causing of an economic downturn in 1837, just as Jackson has left office. Now, because of the way that Jackson is using the power of the presidency, you see the formation of this second party system. And it's really this other party. You have the Democrats under Jackson, and then you have the emergence of what's known as the Whig Party. And if you're a Whig, it means you're anti-king, you're against royal power. So this party is formed from those supporters of John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay, as well as some lingering Federalists from the early 1800s. You have a new sort of third party that was known as anti-Masons, and they will gravitate towards the Whig Party, as well as some Southern and radical states' rights advocates. Because again, even though Jackson believed in states' rights, his stance on nullification had alienated many of the most radical in the South. And so they are moving into this Whig Party as well, not in great numbers, but they form a proportion of this new party. And so that's the second party system, roughly 1832, 33, the Whigs and the Democrats, and it will last until 1854, and then it will break apart over the issue of slavery. And that is for another video.